Hello, my friends. Welcome to Blue Fox Cosplay. On this podcast for today, we will be talking about the very interesting story of Betty and Barney Hill, who have an experience of missing time, a phenomenon that seems to occur anytime there is a UFO abduction or encounters with the extraterrestrial. Super creepy. This occurred back in 1960, so we're going to take quite a little hop through time going backwards. This story does involve some hypnosis, and I'll get into explaining how hypnotherapy actually works in order for this story to have some, relevant background. So here we go. So, the framework behind how hypnosis works basically, if you understand how the mind is set up, you have the conscious mind, which basically is your thinking mind, your doing mind, and then you have the subconscious mind, which kind of runs in the background, and then you have the superconscious, or some people call it the God consciousness, basically the consciousness that knows all, which you have to go through the first two levels of consciousness in order to access that. Hypnosis basically disables the conscious mind and lets you kind of dive into the subconscious mind where things are kind of hidden, sub meaning below. Hypnosis is quite an immersive experience. If you've never had hypnosis done, I would suggest going for it. It's not for everybody. Some people aren't able to be hypnotized or fall into hypnosis, which is just fine. And that also depends on the hypnotherapist. There are some that work better for others, depending on where you're at in life and what you are seeing the hypnotherapist for. But basically, they lull the conscious mind into a state where it's not so active. Like I mentioned before, allowing the subconscious mind to kind of come forward and have access to that information. And this happened in the case of Betty and Barney Hill because they didn't remember what happened in those 2 hours that they lost. So let's jump into the story. So Betty and Barney Hill lived in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. They were married, and Betty was working as a social worker. Barney was working as a postal worker, which was quite a bit away from their home. So he would often come home after long hours, and both of them were just tired. Her job itself as a social worker was probably exhausting because she worked with welfare cases, helping children. Very important job. But they decided after 16 months of being married that they would go on this little belated honeymoon trip to Montreal, Canada. So they kind of left in a hurry. It was kind of a spontaneous trip. So they grabbed like $70 out of the bank, and after 3 days decided, you know what, it's probably time to head back. So on their way back, they noticed that there was some bad weather on the way. There was a hurricane coming, so they decide, you know what, if we go now and keep trucking, we can get there by 2 to 3 in the morning, which would be fine. So they stop at this little diner and, grab a bite to eat, get some coffee for the drive. Of course, Barney's driving, Betty's riding, blah, blah, blah. So this lovely September night in 1961, they're on the road after they've gotten, their food and their coffee. They haven't seen a car for miles and miles. However, they notice this strange light is following them. And they notice this because it's kind of darting and zigzagging through the trees, trying to keep up with them. So it seems to have some kind of intelligence. So could you imagine driving along the road, nobody else is out there, and this odd light that's hovering about 100 feet in the air above the car is just kind of following. And after a while of the light following them, Barney finally decides, you know what, I'm going to pull over and check this thing out and see what's going on. Now, Barney was very intelligent. He had an IQ of 140, so he figured, you know what, maybe it's a satellite or something, but he also concluded that because there was no sound, he knew it wasn't a helicopter. So he's really trying to figure out what this is without alarming Betty. So they pull over. They have a set of binoculars in the car, so he grabs those as well as a pistol and puts it in his pocket for safety. He tells Betty, you know what, wait in the car. I'm going to go check this out and see what's going on. So as Barney gets closer to this floating light, he notices that it's actually a pancake-like disc, and it has a little being in there who has this gray uniform on, and he's looking right at him. And so Barney becomes panicked, and he tried to lift his hand to get to his pistol, but then realizes that for some reason he couldn't. And he hears this voice in his head that tells him to lower the binoculars. And at that point in time, he just freaks out as he realizes, Betty was probably right. It wasn't a satellite. And he starts running back to the car, just barreling towards Betty, trying to get back to her, freaking out. And all of a sudden, the both of them lose consciousness. And they don't remember exactly what happened in that 2 hours until later after a hypnosis therapy. After they lose consciousness, they find themselves 35 miles down the road from where they were, and this is 2 hours later. So once they get home, they try to make sense of what actually happened, and they just can't. So, in the weeks and months after, Betty, who's an avid reader, starts checking out these different books, and then she decides to go ahead and report what happened to the Air Force because she's worried about radiation at that point. She gets into different UFO groups, trying to make sense of what she witnessed and what her experience was. And in the coming years, she starts to get nightmares, different kind of disturbing dreams, and Barney actually starts to develop an ulcer and anxiety. So the both of them seek out some mental health. They go to a psychiatrist named Benjamin Simon, who was a neurologist at the time who specialized in hypnosis. So this was becoming more mainstream at the time. So once they're into these hypnosis sessions, Simon kind of walks them through what happened in order to probe for more information. And come to find out, the Hills, once they were on this ship, they meet these little gray beings, and they were separated and put into two different examination rooms. Of course, they were disrobed. That's never a good start to an alien encounter because it just seems to go one way. But in this particular event, they were asked to sit on these exam tables, very short. Barney recalls that his legs were kind of hanging over the side. And Betty remembers this needle being inserted into her belly, kind of like a weird alien pregnancy test type of deal. And she remembers referring to this one being as the leader, and he's kind of watching. And later, she has a conversation with this leader, and she asks the leader basically where they are, and the being was kind of like joking with her, saying like, if you don't know where you are right now, there wouldn't be a point in telling you where I am. And so later, while she's under hypnosis, she finds that she's able to draw this map of different stars, basically like a map to where these beings were from. Barney actually starts drawing the ship and how it looked, and he draws the little beings inside of the ship that he could see through the windows. And this basically takes flight. This story reaches different media centers, reaches different newspapers, and their alien abduction becomes one of the most known in history. Now, of course, with these other stories coming out, there were, of course, your skeptics and people who, were all for the conspiracy of it. And that's the thing with UFO abductions and extraterrestrial encounters is that the evidence, especially in 1961, if you didn't have a camera or anything with you to basically provide as hard evidence, all you had was word of mouth. But the interesting thing was they didn't recall this 2 hours. And yeah, of course they could have lied about it or whatever, but the weird thing was the hypnosis sessions and how many other people came forward with similar stories matching up to what they were saying. Now, the thing with memory is that it can be flawed. Memories can be disrupted by stress, high adrenaline, mass hysteria, all kinds of things. But I think the thing here was that other people came out and were kind of providing more evidence and different firsthand accounts similar to what they had provided. Psychologist Michael Shermer points to patternicity, which basically is the tendency to see patterns even when they don't exist. So there's always that kind of play into it. But Betty and Barney Hill had a story. Their story seems to be one that has stood the wiles of time and has just provided more questions as time has went along, really. I don't know how I'd feel about pulling over the car to check it out, Barney, on your behalf, rest his soul. I don't know about that. I don't think I would have gone that far. But how crazy would it be to all of a sudden just have 2 hours of your life? Granted, you weren't sleeping or hungover or something crazy like that. But 2 hours just disappearing from your life and you seem kind of in and out of consciousness. So obviously something happened. I think that would be the most frightening part of it all is not knowing what happened at first. So, and then of course, with Betty having these really disturbing dreams later on, which basically led her to go get the hypnosis sessions to find out what happened on that eerie September night in 1961. So, yeah, missing time is quite the phenomena. So, as I stated before, mass hysteria can kind of affect memories just due to the high stress levels and anxiety that is revolving around the event. But there was another similar incident, well, not quite similar, but in the aspect of having eyewitnesses and a lot going on at that time. This occurred in 1952, approximately 9 years prior, and this was during the Cold War. So America was kind of in a bad bit of anxiety anyway. But the Flat Hill Monster was seen at that time, and this was actually in West Virginia. This became a local legend not too long after it was sighted, even though people thought it was just a delirium thing. But the Flatwoods Monster, freaking terrifying. In West Virginia, where the Flatwoods Monster scared the crap out of 6 kids, a mom, and also a dog, and then later the nation. So, 1952, we have the Cold War going on, so of course everybody's hyped up from that. Super high anxiety, lots of mass hysteria. However, a couple of kids went into the woods with their friends. It started off as just the two boys. They were brothers, ages 13 and 12, the May brothers, Ed and Freddie. They were playing along with their 10-year-old friend, Tommy Hyer, and noticed this pulsing red light just streak across the sky and then all of a sudden crashed into a barn that was nearby. So, of course, they ran to grab their mom and then went back to the hill to see what that light was. And a few other boys came along, a dog, and of course, later we actually have one of the newspaper reporters that actually showed up as well. One of these members was also a 17-year-old National Guard member, Gene Lemon, where he leads the group and basically sees what he believes is a pair of bright eyes in the trees. And he screams and kind of stumbles backwards as he realizes, like, oh, shoot, made local news. And very quickly after that, national news and radio were all over this story. And of course, people thought they were crazy. They just thought, maybe they're just making stuff up, or they just kind of laughed it off as hysteria. However, one of the newspaper publishers, Lee Stewart, who was also on that hill on that Saturday, stated that those people were the most scared people he had ever seen, and people didn't make that kind of story up that quickly. So he was actually there on the scene. He went up the hill with a shotgun after witnesses told him, what they saw. And of course, they called the police, who also just believed that it was just hysteria. They said that the monster had grown from 17 to 17 feet in just 24 hours. And the boys described it as a Frankenstein like monster. But this particular monster, this green monster, the Flatwoods Monster, it kind of looks in the pictures that they drew, and I'll drop a little photo below as well. Very, very strange looking. Not quite like a Frankenstein monster at all based off the drawings, but it kind of has this like a raindrop, like a like a raindrop shaped head, but the eyes and the actual head, the skull part sits inside of that, and it kind of has this round chest abdomen portion and almost like a skirted bottom with it just kind of hovers. No legs can be seen, but arms that are definitely clawed. But that's pretty much what they got out of seeing this monster. And it was said to be green with a bright red face and these monstrous eyes. But with the story being so big, there were multiple seemingly credible accounts that just came from eyewitness Air Force pilots. And that appeared in April of 1952. That was 5 months before Ed and Freddie even climbed the hilltop. But there is quite a bit of interesting evidence here. So, based around this story, it's hard to tell exactly what was going on because, again, 1952 is a lot of lack of physical evidence. And I feel like even then, when there are photographs and videos, there's still always the opportunity that maybe somebody fabricated it. But then there's also the question that, our galaxy is huge. And even the many galaxies outside of this one are absolutely huge. And I think it would be almost insanity to assume that we are the only living beings in all of those galaxies, the only intelligent life forms in all of those galaxies. I think would be a huge mistake to assume that, because we really don't know. So either way. But yeah, spooky story. I feel like if I saw something like that, I'd probably just keep it to myself and tell like a couple of friends without them thinking I'm a freaking lunatic, more so than I am now. But yeah, the Flatwoods monster. Just the way it looks by the illustrations is terrifying. So I feel like the drawing alone is enough to scare the pants off of anybody. Even during that time period in 1952, there were several different stories on places like this. This was in West Virginia, but there were several accounts on people catching these men in black who were posing as magazine reporters. Super creepy. But yeah, they would just pop up after these events and just kind of ask general questions. Now, I do know I've read a couple different alien encounter stories where people have had encounters with men in black after they've obtained evidence, like a photo or even just a saved picture on a cell phone, and they will actually ask them to delete it, or they will just confiscate the photo or video, whatever kind of content material it is. They just kind of take it and disappear, and usually advise the person to never speak of it again, which is oddly challenging, I would think. If you've just witnessed something that you know nobody's going to believe and you have evidence, and they tell you just to pretty much keep it quiet, that would probably drive you up the wall. At least I know for me, if I've seen something out of the norm or just something that nobody would believe, but I've witnessed it and it's just me, of course I'd question my sanity at that point, but also at the same time, I would want to talk to somebody about it just because it's bizarre. One story from Reddit, my encounter with the men in black. This occurred in 2004. This was posted by Midnight Sacks about 4 years ago. But basically, they say prior to the men in black incident, I went on a camping trip to Joshua Tree National Park with a few friends. On our last night there, we were looking up at the stars while in front of a campfire. That's when I witnessed a couple of glowing blue UFOs in the night sky going at amazing speeds. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, and my friends were equally amazed and mystified. I tried to take a photo with my flip phone, but the UFOs moved too fast for me to get a clear image of them. On our drive back home, we talked about what we saw and were really excited about it. Not long after, I noticed a black car following me from a distance. I switched lanes to make sure the black car was in fact following me, and sure enough, wherever I went, the car followed. Then when I glanced at my rearview mirror again, the car suddenly disappeared without a trace, which was really unsettling. The next day, after running a few errands, I started driving home, and when I arrived at my house, I saw a black Cadillac parked in my driveway. I tried to convince myself that it wasn't the same black car following me a day ago, but my gut feeling told me otherwise. When I got out of the car, two men in black fedoras approached me and asked if they could ask me a few questions about what I witnessed the night before. I asked them who they were and to see some credentialing. They claimed they worked for a division of the U.S. Air Force. Their appearance looked what I can only describe as plastic and expressionless, and they both had a pale olive skin tone. They spoke in a raspy, monotone voice, and their speech was very precise, sounding almost synthetic. They also had a very cold and intense gaze. Some of the questions they asked were, did you take any photos of what you witnessed? What do you think you saw? Could you describe what you saw that night? Have you spoken about this incident with anyone else who wasn't present with you that night? Would you be withholding any important information from us? Did you find any unusual debris at the location you were that night? Of course, I didn't answer most of their questions honestly, and I did withhold a lot of information as to what I saw and who I was with. They ended their questioning by strongly advising me to refrain from talking about what I witnessed with anyone and to forget the incident ever happened. They also strongly implied that they would be keeping an eye on me in case I decided to ignore their demands. After the encounter, I had this constant ominous feeling for a while and always looked over my shoulder wherever I went. I don't know who these men were or how they had knowledge of what I saw that night, but I believe that they were the men in black. Since that encounter, I've been really hesitant and careful about who I share my experience with, but I finally decided to share it here. Ooh. You have got to love a good creepy Reddit story. And I've been digging for more Men in Black cases. There are quite a few out there. Some with a lot of evidence, some with no evidence at all, of course. But yeah, I'm going to share those with you on the upcoming podcast. So stay tuned, my friends. I just had a really quick epiphany on that whole Men in Black thing. I know in this story he described them as looking plasticky, and they claim they work for, a branch of the U.S. Air Force. But what if they really do work for the government and they just look creepy? Like, what if those are just the type of people that are hired for those positions? Like politicians, kind of like, not all of them, but you know how politicians have this weird look about them, like some ain't quite right. Maybe they just have that type of sleazebally look. I don't know. But that is it for this episode, you guys. I will catch you on the next one. Thank you for hanging out with Blue Fox on Blue Fox Cosplay. Y'all stay cool.